Well, before I read the second part of John Wycliffe from Faith Cook's book, I want to tell you what the book is, because you might like to get a copy. It's published by EP Books and it's called Fine Gold in Yorkshire. And here's the cover so you'll recognise it. So I hope you enjoy part 2, and if you get a copy of the book you'll be able to enjoy the accounts, most interesting accounts of God's dealings in the lives of different people down through the centuries, all from Yorkshire. Well, I hope you'll enjoy this second part and the conclusion of Faith Cook's account of John Wycliffe, the father of the English Reformation. You remember from last time that the Pope had condemned him as a master of errors and accused him of damnable heresies, ordering his trial and imprisonment in 1377. But John Wycliffe had powerful friends, including one John of Gaunt, son of King Edward III, and the trial ended in a farce. Step by step, this Yorkshire Christian man was leading his country onward in its conflict with the papacy. A conflict that would culminate a century and a half later when Henry VIII wished to divorce Catherine of Aragon. Gradually, however, Wycliffe began to lose favour with the English Church, especially when his fearless and logical mind took him on to deny the whole doctrine of transubstantiation. How could the bread and wine held aloft by the priest in the service of the Mass be transformed into the actual body and blood of Christ? He reasoned. When Jesus first instituted this simple service of remembrance celebrated in the communion, he was actually standing before his own disciples, his body whole, his blood not yet shed. His meaning was plain. These elements of bread and wine were symbols only of his body and blood. But this conclusion was a step too far for the English Church as it was then. John Wycliffe was told to be silent on that subject and threatened with imprisonment if he dared repeat such teaching. Even his supporters, such as John Gaunt, melted away. Undeterred, Wycliffe appealed to Parliament, proposing sweeping changes in monastic life and in the Church. These would involve the state taking over some of the vast possessions that the Church had accumulated by bleeding the peasantry with its crushing demands. This, together with his insistence that transubstantiation was a satanic lie, brought this good man into serious trouble. When the Peasants' Revolt took place in 1381, shaking the nation to its core, the Church was quick to lay the blame on John Wycliffe for stirring up the people. Brought to trial once more under the jurisdiction of William Courtenay, Bishop of London, Wycliffe was effectively silenced and banished from Oxford. But he had the last word. "With whom do you think you are contending?" he said. "With an old man on the brink of the grave? No, you are contending with truth itself. Truth is stronger than you and will overcome you." And it did. Wycliffe retired to his Lutterworth parish, and there he spent the last 2 years of his life. Although the bishops intended to silence him, it was at this time that he accomplished what was his greatest life's work, translating the Bible into English, the language of the people. The only text he had to work with was the Latin Vulgate, the version translated from a variety of Greek and Hebrew documents during the 4th century by Jerome, secretary of Pope Damascus. Quietly and diligently, Wycliffe worked with the help of one or two others to give us our first English Bible. Because he had no Hebrew and Greek manuscripts, the translation is often clumsy, sometimes misleading, but a number of expressions are present in the King James Version of 1611, having been taken straight from Wycliffe's own work. Expressions such as, "Enter thou into the joy of thy Lord," and some others. Despite the early English spellings, the translation is not difficult to understand. For example, Genesis 1 verse 1 reads, "In the beginning God made of naught heaven and earth, for so the earth was idle and void, and darknesses wherein on the face of depth." John Wycliffe worked ceaselessly, although often sick and weary. Time was at a premium, for he was nearly 60 and had a great task to finish. Adding to the work of translation was the fact that all had to be written by hand, for William Caxton's printing press was still nearly a century distant. If possible, he was hated yet more by the ecclesiastical hierarchy for this noble endeavour. A later archbishop described John Wycliffe as "this pestilent and most wretched John Wycliffe, a child or pupil of Antichrist, crowned his wickedness by translating the scriptures into the mother tongue." Mercifully, Wycliffe also had many friends willing to labour on the task by copying out the whole or parts of the scripture to meet the seemingly unquenchable thirst of the people to read the Bible for themselves. Not only were there willing scribes around him, but also many highly able men already trained in the universities, sometimes called Wycliffe's Bible men. More popularly, they were known as the Lollards. These men were educated for service in the church, but were thoroughly persuaded of the errors of the papacy and Catholicism. Up and down the country they travelled, carrying portions of Wycliffe's Bible, preaching ceaselessly to the people that acceptance with God did not depend on their good works, but on the mercy of God through Jesus Christ. Not surprisingly, the clerics hated them even more viciously than they did Wycliffe himself. But undeterred, Wycliffe trained more and more of those Bible men and commissioned them to preach everywhere. Village greens, barns, public places, wherever they could secure a hearing. Even in these frail last years of his life, Wycliffe's enemies could not leave him alone, and before long he received a summons to appear before the Pope in Rome. He was willing to go and put the errors of the Church before the papacy itself. But God intervened. He wished his faithful servant to attend a higher court, the court of heaven. A severe stroke made any travel out of the question. Not many days later, after attempting to dispense the communion, he suddenly became paralysed and fell. It was another stroke. Loving hands carried the stricken preacher to his home, where he died 2 days later. It was the 31st of December, 1384. And he was about 60 years of age. Although this heroic Yorkshire man had been removed from the scene of his endeavours, his influence lived on. During the next 30 years or more, the evangelical preaching of his followers, the Lollards, was powerfully effective. So great was their influence, bringing men and women to know the truths of Scripture, that Wycliffe himself has been called the morning star of the Reformation. But with such spiritual achievements among the people, the virulent anger of the church broke out in fearful intensity against the Lollards. Many faced the anguish of death at the stake with incredible courage. Wycliffe himself was out of their reach, but there was one thing they could do. They could still condemn him as an heretic. And on the 9th of December 1427, the order was given to desecrate Wycliffe's grave. His bones were disinterred and publicly burnt. Then his ashes were thrown into the River Swift at Lutterworth. Now at last they were rid of him. And indeed, it seemed they had won. For the next 100 years, truth itself went into hiding. But in 1526, and once more in Oxford, light broke out as scholars there began secretly reading the New Testament in English, this time translated by William Tyndale. And before long, the candle lit by John Wycliffe flared into a brightly burning light as the Reformation broke out in England.